inside a multi-million-dollar emergency room in the heart of Manhattan. The nation's most prestigious doctors declared that a billionaire CEO had less than 1 hour to live. Machines shrieked, while the wealthy board members stood in frozen silence. Right then, a man wearing a dusty old jacket walked through the door, his young daughter trailing behind, holding a worn stuffed bear. The specialists laughed. They saw only a country doctor, a nameless face from nowhere. 30 minutes later, his pure clinical skill left the arrogant hospital entirely speechless. Let's follow this unique story to the end, because the truth about this devoted single father is deeper than any medical miracle. Heavy snow had blanketed Harlem, Montana for 3 straight days with no signs of letting up. It was a bitter, biting cold that crept into historic buildings through leaky walls, slipping right under worn wooden doors that had not been sealed in years. Yet inside the humble medical clinic at the edge of town, a simple structure that once served as a general store, old floorboards creaked underfoot, but the physical warmth inside was steady and real. Dr. Adrian Walker was 40 minutes into treating his 7th patient that morning, when the sweet elderly man sitting across from him repeated his usual line, "You know, Doc, if you practiced down in New York City, you would be rich as sin." Adrian gently pressed his stethoscope against the elderly man's chest, carefully listening for the slight heart murmur he had caught last week. His hands remained perfectly still. They were always steady. "Some things matter far more than money," he answered softly, never looking up. His patient, a local named Frank, had trusted this clinic for 4 years. He lacked health insurance. Most people in Harlem did too. Adrian only charged what folks could spare, accepting whatever wrinkled cash they had. Other times it was just a jar of sweet jam left on the doorstep. He never turned a patient away. Quietly in the corner of the lobby, his 7-year-old daughter Bonnie sat cross-legged on a wooden chair. A ragged stuffed bear was held tight to her chest, her math book balanced on her tiny knees. She inherited her father's deep, quiet, and steady eyes, carrying the unique, calm focus of a child raised around critical medical situations. The locals adored her. Kind grandmothers often baked her treats. Hard-working farmers tipped their dusty hats whenever they walked in. In a mountain community this small, she was simply part of the local scenery. Just like the evergreen forests, the rugged mountains, and the kind doctor who prioritized lives over bills. But what you and I must ask ourselves is why a brilliant heart specialist with Adrian's legendary hands was there at all. They only knew he possessed exceptional medical skill. They watched him resolve crisis situations, cases that would leave city specialists calling for backup, saving a construction worker who severed 3 fingers in a sawing accident, reviving a rancher's wife whose heart stopped suddenly right in her own kitchen, rescuing a teenager who slammed his snowmobile into a post at 60 miles an hour. Adrian saved each one with calm precision, completely free of panic or ego. It was a quiet confidence born not of arrogance but of genuine, deep competence. To them, he was simply their doctor, a compassionate man who valued saving lives over chasing fame. It was just past noon when the old television on my clinic wall flickered. A beat-up screen that barely caught 4 channels, now suddenly flashing urgent breaking news. The broadcast showed the cold, sterile interior of a corporate boardroom high above Manhattan. A wealthy woman in a tailored charcoal blazer collapsed mid-sentence during a globally televised press event. Her name flashed across the bottom of the screen in glaring white letters. Catherine Pierce, Chief Executive of Pierce Biomedical Technologies. The news anchor's voice cut in, sharp and breathless. My old hospital, Manhattan Crown, was quickly assembling its elite cardiac team. Famous specialists were being summoned from all across the country. Insiders whispered that her condition was already highly critical. Bonnie looked up from her workbook. "Dad," she asked, "do you know her?" I had gone completely still. My eyes were glued to the screen, and for a long, heavy moment, a beat just too long, I said absolutely nothing. Then my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. A New York area code. I stared at it. I silently flipped it face down without answering. I knew that 32nd floor. It was built to project only one thing: absolute confidence. Its cold, pale gray walls were kept spotlessly clean. The high-tech machines were the newest and most precisely calibrated money could buy. The famous staff paced the halls with the brisk, arrogant efficiency of people who believed, deep down in their bones, that they were the absolute best in medicine. But empty prestige is never enough. Catherine Pierce was quickly rushed through a private VIP entrance, bypassing the ordinary public emergency room completely. Her personal elite physician had ridden in the ambulance. The hospital's chief of medicine stood waiting right at the door, and within 20 minutes, the most famous, highly decorated cardiac team on the East Coast had gathered around her bed, analyzing her charts, running tests, and exchanging worried looks over her limp body. But what they uncovered was something none of them ever expected. The severe arrhythmia that caused her collapse wasn't from simple stress, as they had first assumed. The high-tech scans revealed a much more disturbing story. A rare hidden structural anomaly. A birth defect so quiet it had survived years of the most expensive medical screenings in the country. The kind of silent flaw that, without a highly specific trigger, could sleep safely inside a patient's chest for decades, until it suddenly woke up. Catherine's heart was failing in a strange pattern these famous doctors had only ever read about. It was accelerating, and every textbook treatment they tried only made it worse. Dominic Hayes, the famous head of cardiology at my former hospital, was a physician completely unaccustomed to self-doubt. At 52, he had authored 3 major landmark surgical papers. With more awards than his walls could hold, he was the undisputed smug king of elite medicine. He had operated on powerful politicians, wealthy celebrities, and foreign heads of state. He refused to panic. But the silent glance he exchanged with his second-in-command. For just a brief second, over Catherine's chart, that glance exposed their fear. Meanwhile, Catherine Pierce was still fully awake. She was a woman who never, in all her life, allowed herself the weakness of feeling helpless. She had built an entire empire from a tiny room and a borrowed laptop. She had survived cutthroat boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. Even a massive public smear campaign launched by an ex-partner who badly underestimated her. Not once had she ever let the world see her show fear. But lying in that hospital bed, hooked to machines buzzing with cold, clinical indifference, she was feeling a sensation she had never known before. The terrifying reality of her own failing body operating completely out of her control. She was absolutely terrified. A young resident named Caldwell, the newest Heart Team addition, and the only one still brave enough to ask the obvious, cleared his throat. "There is a rumor," he said cautiously, "about a surgeon who saved someone with this exact condition 8 years ago. A surgeon named Walker." Evelyn Brooke spoke the name before he could even finish. The head nurse had been working in the room for 20 minutes, silently prepping the equipment, having kept completely to herself until this very moment. Her voice sounded strangely flat, drawing the immediate gaze of everyone in the room. Dominic Hayes reacted with a shift so subtle it was almost invisible. "Almost a simple country doctor," he muttered. It was no question, just a clean clinical dismissal. "We do not need folklore. We need results." Evelyn kept quiet. But behind the calm exterior she had built over 31 years of saving lives in emergency medicine, a lock clicked open. A vivid memory of a face and a legendary name. A story whispered in the shadows of sterile hospital hallways for nearly a decade. She remembered Dr. Adrian Walker the way people remember great storms, by the heavy absolute silence left in their wake. Over in room 7, a heart monitor shifted its rhythm. The warning beep was soft at first, but quickly grew frantic. Dominic stared at the display, whispering with a voice slipping into panic, "We are losing her." There is a quiet kind of grief that never announces itself. It does not come with drama or break down on cue. It simply rests on a soul like snow on a roof, silent and steady, building slowly until the sheer weight collapses everything from within. Dr. Adrian Walker had carried that heavy burden for 6 long years. He was only 32 when he led his first major heart surgery at Manhattan Crown, and the whole surgical staff had crowded in to watch. Not because his age was rare, plenty of young doctors operated, but because of his flawless technique, the incredible deliberate precision. His seamless movement, showing every gesture, had been carefully weighed more than once, thought out 100 times before his hands ever touched the patient. By age 35, he had already saved the life of a sitting president. I was once the golden boy featured in a major medical journal. 3 elite European hospitals fought to recruit me, but I turned them all down for Grace. She was a fourth-grade teacher at a public school in Brooklyn. She had brown eyes, a loud laugh, and this beautiful way of making everyone feel deeply valued. We met at a local farmer's market on a Saturday, and in just 10 minutes, she had already argued with me, forgiven me, and made me laugh. We were married 18 months later. Grace was the absolute best thing to ever happen to me. I told her that, but never nearly as often as I should have. Bonnie arrived when Grace was 29 and I was 31. We just bought a small Park Slope apartment, and my medical career was soaring. Our life possessed that beautiful glowing warmth that only comes right before a devastating loss. Grace was admitted to Manhattan Crown Hospital on a Tuesday in October. A routine, simple surgery that should have taken only 2 hours. She never came home. I investigated her death quietly, methodically, the way I did everything. It took me 3 painful months to piece the truth together. When I finally held the completed picture in my hands, my grief hardened into something cold and sharp. A greedy administrator obsessed with boosting quarterly financial projections. A cheap bulk purchasing deal that swapped out a safe compound in the anesthesia protocol. Not a mistake born of negligence, but a cold decision born of math. Armed with the files, I took my findings to the board. They responded in the careful, defensive language of protecting the hospital's reputation, claiming that the entire matter had been thoroughly reviewed and found completely groundless. I walked out of Manhattan Crown that very evening and never looked back. I drove north with baby Bonnie fast asleep in her car seat, stopping only when the smooth highway dissolved into a 2-lane road and then into rough gravel, until the gravel led to a tiny town where nobody knew my name. That town was Harlan, Montana, and I stayed. Today, I sat in the kitchen of the modest house I rent from the county, holding her photograph. Grace at 30, smiling outside the school where she taught, laughing at something off camera. I looked at that picture the way a lost soul checks for a fixed, unchanging point. Not because I doubted her reality, but because I needed proof the world still held me. My phone had vibrated 4 more times since that call from New York. I ignored every single alert, then a final text arrived. "She will die before morning if you do not come. No one else can do this, Evelyn." I stared at the screen. From the hallway, Bonnie's voice drifted in, soft and quiet. "Dad, Mom would want you to go save that person." I closed my eyes. We fled Harlan at 11:15 that night. My old pickup was packed with just 1 duffel bag and Bonnie's backpack, carrying her schoolbooks, 3 granola bars, and her favorite stuffed bear, Button. Driving from Montana to New York, under normal circumstances, is not a journey a rational doctor would take without a night of sleep and a solid, detailed plan. Adrian had neither. He drove through those first hours in silence, watching the highway stretch into the pale headlights as the quiet safety of the mountains slipped away behind him. Bonnie lasted exactly 2 hours on the road before asking her question. "Dad," she murmured from the passenger seat, tucking her feet beneath her. Clasping her favorite toy, she asked, "Why do people call you a country doctor?" He let the question hang a moment. "Because they have never seen me work," he said. Bonnie considered this with the quiet gravity she gave to most serious things. "Is that because you left? That is part of it. Were you really good back then?" Adrian glanced at his daughter. The soft dashboard light caught her face, and for a split second she looked so much like her mother that his heart ached with a quiet, familiar pain. "Yes," he said, "I was. Are you still?" He did not answer. He just watched the dark road. A lonely gas station flashed by, then a silent water tower. Then a bridge over a frozen creek. "I suppose we will find out," he said. They stopped for fuel somewhere out in Wyoming. Standing under the brutal white glare of a truck stop at 3 a.m., drinking terrible coffee from styrofoam cups, Bonnie drifted off to sleep again before they hit the interstate. Her head tilted slowly toward his shoulder until she was leaning entirely against him, one tiny hand still clutching her toy's worn ear. Adrian kept driving in absolute silence, no music, no phone calls. He thought about Grace, and of the day he walked away from the sterile glass doors of Manhattan Crown Medical Center. He knew the heavy price of returning to a place that had already torn his entire life apart. He thought about Catherine Pierce, a woman he had never actually met. He had only watched the same shocking footage as everyone else. He watched her collapse during a live press conference, folding like a structure losing its foundation. Yet, in just a brief 3-second television clip, he saw it. The chaotic heart rhythm flashing on the monitor in the corner of the screen. He recognized the danger instantly, with the absolute certainty of a healer who spent 15 years decoding what these monitors were trying to say. In that single moment, he knew exactly what was destroying her heart, and he knew precisely how few heartbeats she had left. He was sure that the Decalo doctors at Manhattan Crown would spot the crisis. He wanted to trust their reputation. He truly tried to. He flipped his phone face down, but Evelyn's urgent text contained a truth he simply could not ignore. No one else can do this. Not for lack of skill, but because no other surgeon had ever faced this specific cardiac anomaly. He had dealt with it once, 8 years ago, in an unrecorded, quiet victory. In a delicate surgery he never bothered to publish. In an operating room with only 2 witnesses, both of whom had long since retired. He was the last doctor on Earth who possessed the precise skill to save her. The dark highway stretched ahead. The flashing lights of New York were still hours away. As Bonnie slept soundly against his shoulder, Adrian kept driving. Manhattan Crown was the polar opposite of his quiet Montana clinic. A monument of glass and steel filled with the sterile glare of modern prestige. A cold structure with zero tolerance for shadows. Rising 40 floors up, its lobby was a sterile cathedral of polished marble and expensive empty corporate art. Its corridors flowed with people who wore their elite credentials, like a protective suit of armor. Adrian stepped through the grand entrance at 7:14 in the morning. He wore a rugged jacket that had survived 3 harsh Montana winters. His worn boots still carried traces of road salt and melted snow. He hadn't even shaved since Tuesday. No briefcase, no fancy folders, nothing to advertise his elite medical status. To the elite crowd watching him cross that polished lobby, he was exactly what he looked like, a man who had traveled a long distance and arrived exhausted. Bonnie walked right beside him, a toy tucked under one arm, her backpack on her shoulders. She studied her surroundings with a quiet, sharp focus that was uniquely her own. She didn't look intimidated. Honestly, she rarely seemed intimidated by anything. Evelyn Brooks stood waiting for them, near the elevator bank. A small woman in her mid-60s, she wore her silver hair closely cropped. Her face was set in the sharp look of a doctor who refused to waste time on polite formalities. She quietly studied Adrian for a brief moment before speaking. Then she simply said, "You came, tell me the current state," and he listened. Walking quickly through the halls, she efficiently laid out the patient's critical cardiac profile. She detailed the suspected device failure and the interventions they had already attempted, and precisely how those panicked efforts had only made things much worse. She was the best kind of clinical ally. Observant, precise, and completely composed. The conference room housing the elite heart specialists was up on the 6th floor. Evelyn pushed the door open. 12 doctors looked up. The air was thick with tension and that specific institutional dread that builds when highly credentialed specialists realize they are completely out of their depth. Dominic Hayes commanded the head of the massive table, surrounded by patient charts. He stood tall, desperate to project the authority of a man who ruled this hospital universe. No matter who just walked in. He glared directly at Adrian. His judgmental eyes swept over the faded jacket, the dirty boots, and the little girl waiting in the doorway. "You drove all night just to play the hero?" Dominic sneered. Whispers rippled through the tense room, followed by a quiet cough. Another doctor, whose name Adrian didn't know, leaned in toward his colleague and muttered, in a voice that carried easily, "We really want this guy leading a critical cardiac case." Adrian didn't waste his breath responding to their petty remarks. Instead, he approached the table, grabbed the patient's chart, and silently began to read. The entire room watched him. Some stared with pure contempt. Others watched with a guarded curiosity, suddenly questioning whether they should trust the order to dismiss him. Near the back, a young resident looked over at little Bonnie and spoke up softly, saying apologetically, "Your little girl can hear all of this." It was aimed at Adrian, but was a quiet reminder to everyone there. Dominic's cold expression never wavered. After 3 minutes and 12 seconds of deep silence, Adrian looked up, the room so quiet that the ventilation system's hum was deafening. "You are killing her," he warned. The room froze as he set down the medical chart. His voice stayed calm, unhurried, and absolutely certain. "This irregular rhythm is not primary. It is a reaction triggered by the device interacting with her existing heart condition. Your treatments over the last 14 hours have only fed this dangerous reaction. If you keep following this protocol," he paused, not to be dramatic. "Because true precision saves lives, she will not survive another surgery." Dominic's jaw tightened. "You have no authority here," he said. "You are just a country doctor now, out of the operating room for 6 years. You do not even hold an active state license." "You have no," but the emergency siren from room 7 cut him off through the heavy walls. Catherine Pierce's heart had just flatlined for the first time. The hallway outside room 7 filled up instantly. Nurses arrived first, then the residents. Then came the senior specialists, moving with the quiet, controlled pace of experienced healers who know that panic only wastes precious seconds. Dominic rushed ahead, shouting out orders and relying on the loud institutional authority of the emergency room. Adrian stepped right past him, showing no panic and no aggressive ego. He simply moved with a fluid purpose. The focused drive of a healer who never needed titles to command respect. And the anxious crowd gathered at the door parted for him without a single word. That is what happens when someone's quiet expertise is absolutely undeniable. Inside the room, Catherine lay motionless beneath the flashing monitors. Her face was gray, her lips pale. She was already 40 seconds into cardiac arrest. "He does not have a license here," a voice called out, trapped between useless rules and sheer panic. "She is dying," Adrian said, stating it as simple fact, not an argument. He calmly pulled on his gloves. He caught Evelyn's eye. She was already at the cabinet, anticipating his next move. "She has been my patient for 17 seconds, Adrian said. "Let us begin." What followed over those next 9 minutes left everyone in the room completely breathless. It was hard to put into words later, not because of any dramatic medical theater. The room was actually very quiet, but the sheer depth of his focus was mesmerizing. The perfect harmony between his eyes and his hands created a deep, reverent silence among the onlookers. The silence of witnessing true mastery. He bypassed the standard textbook resuscitation. Instead, he moved through a sequence none of these big city doctors had ever witnessed. A precise blend of targeted medication and manual adjustments that did not just treat the heart attack itself, but stopped the hidden chain reaction that triggered it. He stabilized her rhythm gently at the source, rather than shocking her heart with brute force. He spoke softly as he worked, talking her through it. Not to show off, but to guide Evelyn. She executed every move with the flawless accuracy of someone who had spent 30 years learning what truly mattered. Dominic stood frozen at the back of the room, his arms hanging limp. His expression was a strange blur, not quite anger, not quite defeat, and definitely not the arrogant confidence he had started with. It was closer to awe. Like hearing a beautiful song in a tongue he had long forgotten he once spoke. "You are going to trigger a secondary arrest," Dominic warned as Adrian reached the critical turning point of the surgery. "If you finish that sequence, the ventricle will." "I know exactly what it will do," Adrian replied, not looking back. "I have saved lives this way, have you?" The room fell completely silent. In the quiet hallway outside, his daughter Bonnie waited patiently on a plastic chair, clutching a small button tightly in her lap. A volunteer had offered to lead her to a comfortable room with juice and television. But Bonnie politely thanked her and shook her head. She had to stay where she could watch the door to her father's room. She sat perfectly still. She kept her back straight, watching that closed door with the absolute trust of a child who knew, from 7 years of quiet proof, that her father was always worth the wait. Inside room 7, exactly 7 minutes in, the patient's heart suddenly flared back to life. This was no weak, struggling flutter of a forced muscle, but a clean, steady, and beautifully strong rhythm. The monitor's steady beep shifted. Every doctor in that room felt the change resonate deep in their own chest. It was a sound of pure life, so visceral that it bypassed their minds and struck them as raw relief. Adrian quietly stepped back. He removed one surgical glove and studied the screen for 3 silent seconds. "She is stable," he announced. No one whispered. Turning around, he faced 12 stunned physicians staring back at him. Dominic stood there, his smug academic certainty completely shattered, the foundation of his rigid rules washed away in an instant. Adrian calmly removed his other glove and tossed them both into the bin. Then, he walked out to the hallway where his daughter eagerly waited. Sitting down right beside her, she gently leaned against his strong arm. No words were spoken, none of them were needed anyway. Word of what happened spread through the hospital corridors the way gossip always does. It traveled quietly through service hallways and break rooms, through those informal channels that live in every massive hospital, bridging official reports and what everyone actually knows. By noon, every single floor of the medical center had heard the tale. By 2 o'clock, the legend reached the executive suites and the board of directors' exclusive dining room. By 3 in the afternoon, 3 separate department heads were digging through the archived files of Dr. Adrian Walker, formerly of Manhattan Crown. What they uncovered silenced every one of them. They were quieted not because the news was scandalous, but because the shocking, undeniable gap between what they had proudly assumed and the stunning truth was simply too massive to ignore. It was like realizing you had been proudly reading a map upside down the whole time. Adrian Walker had once performed open-heart surgery on a sitting president. He had written the definitive landmark research on congenital heart disease that remains even to this day mandatory, reading in 9 of the country's top 12 medical institutions. He had trained surgeons who now ran elite departments, published famous papers, and chased shallow institutional awards. One of those young doctors was Dominic Hayes. At 28, Dominic was terrified of his own hands before Adrian spent 3 months teaching him the true courage to heal. He had stood inside a quiet operating room learning under Adrian's guidance, learning that surgery was never about absolute certainty. It required steady competence in the face of the unknown. He once honored Adrian in his very first medical research paper, but institutional reputation made him forget that simple truth. Or perhaps he had simply filed it away, choosing elite status over the true art of saving lives. Now he sat alone in his office, staring at the old file, remembering what real medicine used to mean. Down in room 7, Catherine Pierce slowly opened her eyes. It was the slow awakening of a completely exhausted body, one that had given everything and needed time to reconnect with the physical world. As her eyes cleared, she did not see a famous high-priced doctor, nor the expensive monitors or the ceiling of her luxury hospital suite. Instead, she saw a little girl sleeping peacefully in a chair across the room. Her small head was tilted in that sweet, trusting way only children sleep, totally at peace, holding a worn stuffed bear tightly against her chin. The child had clearly been waiting there for hours. A kind soul had gently draped a thin hospital blanket over her. Her dark hair fell across her face. Meanwhile, Catherine Pierce had built a $9 billion empire. She had spoken on massive global stages and run deals across 12 time zones, making heavy decisions that directly impacted the lives of tens of thousands of workers. She had been praised by every major financial journal and news outlet in the country. They labeled her formidable and visionary, while critics called her far less flattering things. She had not shed a single public tear since she was 19. Yet she stared at that sleeping child, a little girl who traveled all night in a battered truck because her father answered the call to save a life, and patiently waited in a cheap plastic chair outside a closed operating room door, because she knew her father was truly worth waiting for. Catherine felt a sudden, deep shift in the cold armor she used as a heart. It was not weakness, it was the absolute opposite. It was finally recognizing what truly mattered. She was still watching little Bonnie when Adrian quietly appeared in the doorway. Their eyes met, but neither of them said a single word. Some moments are simply too profound for mere words to carry. Evelyn Brooks had guarded the truth for 6 years, not out of loyalty to the hospital. That institutional loyalty had long expired, shattered when the board dismissed Adrian's warning to protect their elite reputation, burying the truth like they always did. She kept quiet only because she was a realistic woman, and she knew in the weeks after Adrian left that the dark secret she held would only cause him deeper pain. So she waited until he truly needed the truth to fight back. She finally told him on the second night, inside a quiet lounge smelling of burnt coffee. I smelled coffee and disinfectant while Bonnie slept down the hall in Evelyn's office. Grace Walker, she told me, hadn't died from a simple, isolated clinical mistake. The anesthesia protocol she had received that Tuesday in October was altered 6 weeks earlier, part of a corporate cost-cutting deal quietly negotiated between our greedy finance department and a major pharmaceutical supplier. The prestigious committee that approved it had been fed falsified efficacy data, and the compassionate doctors administering it were never told they were using a new compound. The status-driven administrator who had signed off on the dangerous drug swap received a massive performance bonus that December. I listened in silence. Evelyn studied my face but saw no anger there. All my anger had burned out years ago. Instead, she saw a doctor looking at the final page of a long, painful medical proof. The missing piece of a tragedy I had suspected but couldn't fully prove until now. "There is more," Evelyn whispered. She placed a thick folder on the table between us. It held medical documents she had stashed in a safety deposit box years ago, knowing these secrets would eventually matter to someone's life or death. The pharmaceutical supply group that had provided the substitute compound held a 17% equity stake owned then by a holding company. That holding company was the investment vehicle of Robert Pierce, a powerful man who died 4 years ago, whose daughter was my patient, Catherine. The silence that followed this revelation was far heavier than any clinical silence we'd shared over the last 48 hours. Those were just the quiet gaps between medical facts. This was personal. "She doesn't know," Evelyn said. "I'm sure she doesn't." I stared at the folder but did not touch it. "Does it even matter?" I asked. "It will matter to her," she replied. "Yes." I fell quiet. She would have to choose her own path with this truth. Catherine discovered the truth the next morning. The folder sat on the table beside her bed when she woke, with a brief note from Evelyn. "You should read this." She read those pages 3 times. Then she lay in her hospital bed for an hour, staring blankly at the ceiling. And for once in her busy, prestigious career, she didn't immediately reach for her phone. When I walked in to check on her that afternoon, she studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an explanation," she said, "and likely far more than that." "You owe me nothing," I replied, "but my father's company." "I know." Her voice caught slightly as she said my name. "After what my family cost you, why did you still save me?" I was quiet, letting her question linger in the room. Through the glass wall, I could see Bonnie waiting in the corridor outside, sitting with Evelyn, doing her math homework with her favorite toy propped beside her. "Because of her," I said. "She still believes that every life is worth saving." I decided on the drive here that I'd rather be the compassionate doctor she believes I am than the cynical man I was becoming. Catherine looked at the little girl through the glass window. She had no response. True medicine speaks louder than words anyway. Catherine Pierce did not build a $9 billion empire by moving slowly. By the time I cleared her to sit up for over an hour, she had already gotten a complete briefing from her legal team and carefully studied the records Evelyn provided. Then she cross-referenced everything with 3 years of internal compliance reports her staff recovered from her father's old firm. What she uncovered was deeply unsettling. The questionable pharmaceutical investment had been finalized completely without her knowledge, years before she took over total executive control of the broader family holdings. She inherited the company, not those bad choices. But she understood reality. She possessed the sharp clarity of someone who spent years answering for hard truths and holding others accountable. In the end, how a mess started did not matter, only who fixed it. Then she saw exactly what Dominic Hayes had done. The chart notes from those 47 hours before my arrival spoke with the brutal honesty of clinical records. Charts do not lie. Read closely, they expose the exact sequence of a doctor's failure. Dominic saw the dangerous device interaction pattern on the morning of that second day. He noted the risk, documented it, and still refused to alter his treatment protocol. Not because he lacked the medical competence to fix it, but because admitting his mistake meant ruining the sterling reputation he valued more than his patient's life. He could not bear to confess in front of his peers that he was wrong. He decided, consciously or not, that saving his prestigious title outweighed saving a human heart. Catherine almost died for his pride. She quickly called a private, closed-door board meeting on the 5th day after her condition stabilized. They met in the exact conference room where my team had debated how to save her. Dominic was there, alongside the entire hospital board. Even the hospital lawyers were in attendance. Catherine spoke for 11 quiet minutes without once raising her voice. She did not put on a theatrical show just to look strong, like some corporate executives do. She spoke with the raw honesty of a patient who knows the truth is powerful enough on its own. She laid out Dominic's failures and backed them with cold, hard evidence. She presented the timeline, the medical records, and his exact moment of deviation. She made it clear that if I had not walked in when I did the next surgery, the procedure scheduled for the 3rd morning, which Dominic stubbornly refused to correct, would have killed her on the operating table. The boardroom fell silent. Their lawyer tried to deflect, muttering about administrative procedures, internal reviews, and following proper institutional channels. Catherine cut him off with one sharp look. "I am the patient who almost died," she said, "and I am telling you the truth. We can talk policy after we face reality." Dominic sat at the end of the table, utterly speechless. He had entered that room clinging to his grand title. He would walk out stripped of his hollow authority. I was nowhere near the hospital when this showdown happened. I had taken Bonnie to a quiet diner down the street, watching her happily work her way through a huge stack of pancakes. Over pancakes, she happily described the lessons she wanted to share with her class after break. He hadn't stood there seeking credit. No one had asked him to. He didn't even ask for updates. Healing was reward enough. He knew that true clinical success doesn't require an audience. The invitation arrived Wednesday morning, stamped with a prestigious, high society medical logo. It was delivered by a representative hand-picked to project corporate power. She was steady enough to face a doctor who ignored medical hierarchies. A man who didn't bow to famous corporate names. Adrian stood in the small kitchen of their cheap Penn Station hotel room, reading the paper while keeping his heart grounded. Nearby, Bonnie ate her breakfast at the tiny window table, gazing at the street below. By ordinary medical standards, the package was absolutely staggering. They offered him command of a new heart center, a state-of-the-art facility backed by massive corporate funding, complete medical authority, custom hiring power, and an 8-figure clinical research fund. An astronomical salary that completely dwarfed any actual human need. He quietly folded the paper, unimpressed. "What does it say?" Bonnie asked, still staring outside. "They want to offer me a position," he said. "Is it a good one? It pays far more than any role I've ever seen." Bonnie paused, considering. "Are you going to accept it?" "I doubt it," he replied. Later that afternoon, he met with Catherine. She was in a private luxury suite, wearing regular clothes instead of a gown. It was her stubborn condition for agreeing to stay under medical care. Her laptop lay open, phone in hand, the posture of a patient whose physical body was weak but whose ambition never slept. A brilliant mind completely refusing to yield to illness. She looked up as he entered. "You read the contract?" "I did," he replied. "And I wanted to turn you down face to face because you deserve that respect." Catherine put her phone down. She analyzed him with the same clinical, direct gaze she had used for years to measure real human competence over empty corporate promises. "We need elite medical talent like yours here, Adrian, not in rural Montana. Those small-town communities deserve competent, compassionate care, too. They can find basic doctors. But the clinical courage you showed in that operating room is incredibly rare." "I know," he said, "but fame isn't why I walked." "Then why stay hidden?" Her gentle tone carried genuine concern. It was a question from someone who had spent hours quietly reflecting on their own past choices and tallying up the true human cost. Adrian studied his hands, the very hands that had bravely stabilized a dying woman's heart 2 days ago. The same hands that for 6 years had quietly served the modest needs of a small rural community. Managing simple, everyday life and death situations. "I stopped trusting my clinical judgment," he admitted. "I know how corporate medicine strips away your compassion and corrupts your soul," Catherine noted gently. "I know you do," he replied, as a comfortable, understanding silence filled the room. "This position isn't about hiring the most famous specialist on paper," she continued. It's about practicing medicine with actual soul, so no one suffers like your wife did. I want you to help me do that." I looked toward the window. I thought of Grace, of the generous, quiet way she used to move through this world. She lived with the conviction that every single person she met deserved to feel like the most important person in the room. I thought of Bonnie waiting outside the ICU, holding her stuffed bear and still believing. I thought of the heavy burden I had carried, and what it would mean to finally let it go. "I'll think about it," I said. 1 year later, our Walker Pierce Center for Cardiac Care opened its doors on an early spring Tuesday. We did not build a flashy glass tower. We took over a renovated 5-story building in a neighborhood that had been labeled transitional by city planners for the better part of 2 decades. This meant we sat right between a laundromat and a community garden near a public school. And the families living within walking distance were the very people who, until now, had spent their lives struggling through a healthcare system built only for the wealthy. Those with endless options and the specific kind of corporate paperwork standard hospitals demand before they even offer to help. We weren't completely free, but our sliding scale was so compassionate that for most patients it basically was. Catherine Pierce had restructured 4 entire corporate divisions just to fund our clinic's endowment. She did it openly, ignoring her PR team's warnings that it might look bad to investors. Yet she published it anyway, completely unchanged. Over the past year, she had simply stopped making choices based on investor opinions. This bold move did not actually destroy her company. In fact, it did something her corporate finance department struggled for months to make sense of. The company's actual valuation shot up. It turns out, many more people wanted to put money behind a firm whose leader chose real integrity over a polished image than her advisors ever expected. Catherine found this pretty amusing, the same way she enjoyed anything that defied conventional corporate logic. She stood right at our entrance on opening day, watching our very first patients walk in. They arrived slowly, mostly in 1s and 2s. A grandmother pushing a walker, helped by her teenage grandson who held the door open. 2 men in dusty work clothes, coming straight to us from their job site. A young mother with 3 kids, one completely mesmerized by the colorful painted fish on our waiting room wall. I had chosen those fish myself. I was already inside, handling the morning cases with the calm, focused care that had now become, over the last 12 months, the absolute heart of our clinic's healing culture. I had assembled a medical team sharing these exact beliefs. Brilliantly skilled, completely uninterested in prestige or hierarchy, and utterly unable to ever turn a patient away. Our clinic treated twice as many patients as we planned for in month 1. We were featured in 3 national medical journals, completely without my knowledge or consent. I never read those articles. But I did let Bonnie keep the issue with my photo. As long as she hid it somewhere, I wouldn't have to face it every day. She had placed it right in his office, and he kept it right there. Bonnie, now 8, went to school nearby and spent her afternoons in a quiet little room set aside just for her near the main clinic office. No formal title needed, it was her space. There she did homework and taped her colorful drawings directly onto the wall. The entire staff quickly learned her name by heart. Even patients in the waiting room knew her by the teddy bear she held. Button was worn, soft and completely irreplaceable to her. Above her desk, she hung a simple photograph of her late mother. Just below it was a piece of colored cardstock, written in her neat 8-year-old handwriting. It read, "Medicine without compassion is just business." Adrian stared at those words, standing completely still as the truth sank in. Then he quietly asked her who had shared that wisdom. "Nobody," Bonnie replied. "I just figured it out myself." Late on opening day, a lone man quietly stepped through the clinic doors. He looked to be in his 60s, wearing a heavy, worn canvas jacket. He walked with the heavy, guarded steps of a man whose body had been failing him far longer than he would ever admit. The receptionist looked up warmly from behind the desk. "Sir, do you happen to have health insurance today?" He shook his head, looking deeply uncertain. His eyes held the weary look of someone used to rejection, fully expecting to be shown the door again. From down the hallway, Adrian did not hesitate for a second. "Don't worry," he said. "We've got you covered." The stranger looked up, something softening instantly in his face. It was that sudden quiet relief when someone braced for a door to close finds it wide open instead. Catherine watched this quiet miracle unfold from her spot near the hallway window. Soft evening sunlight poured through the glass, casting long, warm shadows across the floor. She had only planned to stay an hour, yet she had been here since 7 that morning. She observed Adrian walking directly toward the waiting patient. She saw him extend his hand to the man wearing the old, worn jacket. He spoke softly, causing the man's tense shoulders to finally drop. They had been held high with stress for what seemed like an eternity. For the first time in countless years, Catherine felt a spark of something she recognized as true hope. Not corporate strategy. Not the empty promises found in boardrooms and quarterly financial reports. The real kind. The profound hope born of pure compassion, present in spaces where dedicated healers simply strive to save lives and support one another. She stood at that window for a long time. Then she stepped inside to serve.